I'm gonna, oh, you got it. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that's the world we live in these days. So we all understand. So I think we will go ahead and get started, just because we may still have some more people coming in. But I want to say thank you to Stephen Kniffley for being willing to do this session for us today. I've heard Stephen speak a couple of times, and he also did um, session on navigating microaggressions for us last year that you can go and watch in the CTL recordings if you haven't had a chance to look at that. And his work and what he has to share with us is always so important. So I hope most of you have met Stephen by now. He is an associate professor now in the School of Psychology and also our chief of diversity. And we are very blessed, I would say, to have him at Spalding. And so I'm just going to turn things over to you, Stephen, and the recording is started, so we're ready to go.
Absolutely ready to go. Let me put my PowerPoint on. All right. So today, my goal is to talk a little bit about what it looks like to create an inclusive classroom. So I'm going to cover a couple of topics during our time because I believe in kind of experiential hands-on learning. I'll do a little bit of didactic, and then I'll pause and show a video, and I'm hoping we'll have a discussion following that as a way to end our time together. So two topics that I have that I want to discuss during our time are what does it look like to foster an inclusive classroom climate, recognizing that you can't have an inclusive classroom until you have a foundation where everybody feels included. And then also thinking through how can we connect with culturally different students as part of our effort to make that classroom an inclusive setting. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of offer some context. Well, why is it even important to have this particular conversation around the need for having a more inclusive classroom? So I think about my sister, for example. She will be starting at Transylvania University here next week, I believe, which is wild to think about because I remember holding her in my arms, and it's just wild thinking that she's now this adult who's going off to school. But her generation of kids are our most diverse generation of college students that many of our college campuses have ever seen. And so there's this kind of dynamic where our student population is increasing in diversity at a very rapid rate. Additionally, there's this increasing need for students to be able to develop their cultural communication skills, as well as being able to navigate diverse environments and interpersonal dynamics. And what better way for them to learn those skills than within the within our classroom settings, where they're able to apply in real time the knowledge and information that they're learning, as well as having conversations with folks that are different from themselves. Additionally, there's been increased calls for equity and inclusion on college campuses, which has trickled down into our classrooms as well. There's also, because of that increased call for equity and inclusion, an increased need for faculty and staff to be able to support and address growing campus diversity, specifically utilizing more culturally responsive teaching, and then really thinking meaningfully about what inclusive curriculum looks like. And then, of course, students are why we're here, both because we care about them and we're passionate about them, um, and also because they help financially support what we do here at Spalding. And so we have to be able to retain them. We have to be able to recruit them and retain them here at our institution. The only way that we're going to do that is by making sure that they feel included and supported and affirmed based on their learning styles, based on the cultural differences that they come in with, and based on feeling like we're helping them to get to their next stage in life. So the first thing I want to talk about here is this idea of fostering an inclusive climate. And there are a couple of things I want to highlight here. Some I'll talk about on this slide, and the rest I'll talk about in individual slides. So when it comes to fostering an inclusive climate, it's important to remember that we have to set a foundation, and a foundation is rooted in the guidelines and boundaries that we put in place in order to make the space a brave space for everybody to exist in as their whole selves. The next piece that we'll talk about is this idea of intentional representation. As you think about your curriculum, as you look around your classroom, as you think about the folks that you highlight and experiential activities, etc., is it rooted in a negative image of marginalized folks, or is it serving as an erasure of the marginalized folks' experience? And so, really thinking about how can we elevate more positive images of folks within our curriculum, and then also in our surrounding classroom. We talked about this the last time a little bit, but it's also important for us to remember this idea that we have to address microaggressions in order to have an inclusive environment. And so thinking thoughtfully about, well, what does it look like to have those micro interventions for microaggressions in our space? Because many students now are wanting not just to listen to an instructor get up and lecture for an hour and a half, etc. They want instead to be able to test the material real time through conversation. It's really important for us to think about how can we foster a space where folks understand the difference between a debate, a discussion, and a dialogue. The last piece here, and this is what I'll talk about in this slide, is to think about how, as we're having those discussions, as we're navigating microaggressions potentially in the space, as we're thinking about folks' adherence to our ground rules and guidelines, making sure that we're constantly checking the temperature of the room when it comes to our classroom setting. And so as you think about particular topics becoming heated, or you think about folks maybe disengaging from the conversation and becoming more apathetic, it's really important to take a pause somewhere in our time with our students to ask, how are things going? Should I do a 180 in terms of the activities that we're doing? Should I go into a different direction in terms of the conversations that we're having? Because as instructors, we have to be willing to shift not only just from semester to semester, but also within the same classroom setting. Because sometimes what you have planned to do simply doesn't work or isn't working because of just the time of day, the dynamics that the students are experiencing, or even just any sort of personal things that you also might be going through. And so it might be helpful to just try to check the temperature and say, how are we doing right now? Are you learning the material? Is the content resonating with you? And is there something I could do uh, instead? So when it comes to the ground rules, there are a couple of them that are important for us to consider. Hey, buddy. There's a couple of ground rules for us to consider in our space. The first one here is to share, not compare. So as we're thinking about working with our students, it's really important for us to foster this space where we create an openness for everybody to share their experiences without judgment or anything along those lines. And the way that we offer that is by saying that, we all have different ways of coming into the world. We all are bringing in different ways of thinking about the world, and no space is different. No space is better than anybody else's space. It just is. Also reminding that we're all learning about diversity and working with diverse folks and being around diverse individuals through the social rules that we've been given. And so remind ourselves that as a student responds to content or does not respond to content, or offers a competing thought to what another student is saying, etc., that all of these thoughts and behaviors are coming from what that student, what we as the instructor have learned about how do we respond when we come across certain content, how do we respond based on certain learning styles, certain individuals, etc. And so that's our baseline that many of us are attempting to learn and grow from. As you think about this idea of ground rules, it's really important for us to seek first to understand and then be understood, and reminding our students that when a competing thought is offered up, that really engaging in those reflective experiences is important, both as a way to get the most out of class, but then also as one of those skills that is needed from a communication standpoint to be effective in our society. And so really working with folks to say, well, what did you hear in that student's comment? Um, Student, did that person get right what you were trying to say? And as a way to help folks to feel understood in the space. Encouraging your students to stay leaned into the process and thinking about what obligation do we have as instructors to keep the material interesting and something that engages the student, not just based solely on the content, but also based on its connection to the real world experience. As we think about ways to create this inclusive environment, it's important to remember to understand the difference between impact versus intent, and really working with students as well as with ourselves to think thoughtfully about not leaning on our good intentions, but also being willing to acknowledge the impact of our words, thoughts, and behaviors on those around us as best as you can when it comes to particularly sensitive conversations within the classroom dynamic, always encouraging your students to bring those conversations back into the classroom space. The last piece here is, we're in this kind of call out culture piece. And so it's real easy for folks to just tell people that they're wrong based on their lived experience, their background, the things that they're saying, et cetera. And so it's really important for us um, to encourage our students as well as ourselves to call folks into a conversation about how they could do things differently rather than just leaning into calling folks out. So when we talk about this idea of intentional representation, it's important to think about a couple of dynamics here. The first one is that if if we are going to feel comfortable offering representation of folks that are different from ourselves, we first must feel comfortable in our own dynamic, in our own culture, because a lot of stereotypes, discrimination, various isms come from a place of anxiety and insecurity about who we are as individuals. And so we have to be able to own our own cultures as well as be able to have conversations about it because we will be asking those things of our students. And so I want to make sure we can model that for them. Another thing that's important here is to learn about the cultures that our students are coming from. Many of our students are coming from all walks of life, right? So socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, disability status, immigration status, race, ethnicity, etc. And so it's really important for us to learn about the places that our students are coming from, learning about the areas of town that they're coming from. That way we can have a working knowledge to have conversation as well as to understand the context in which the student is communicating to us. It's also important for us to be prepared to talk about stereotypes and microaggressions and making sure that we are able to name those in the space. One of the easiest ways to damage an inclusive classroom is by not naming a stereotype that you hear or a microaggression that's expressed in the space because the students are looking to us to create some sense of safety, space, etc. So it's really important for us to be able to address those in real time. When it comes to representation, it's also important to include positive examples of the cultures represented by your students. And so making sure within your curriculum, within the examples that you use to contextualize your content, speakers that you bring into your classroom, et cetera, are they folks that your students can respond to based on some shared experience? And also making sure that that experience is not rooted in is not rooted in the negative solely. So acknowledging that marginalization exists, bringing in folks that can articulate that, but also folks that are able to highlight the resiliency within those populations as well. It's also important to think through as you have control over who's represented in the decorations in your classrooms. Um, if we think about this idea of stereotype threat and all of that, literally, if a student looks around and they do not see themselves present or affirmed in some way, that can have an impact on their ability to perform well academically within the school, within the classroom setting. And also here, just making sure to audit your pedagogy for accessibility. So, are we only utilizing lecture? Are we only utilizing midterm final test as a way to evaluate students' learning progress, etc.? Or we think about making sure that we incorporate a wide variety of ways for the students to retain the information through visual means, through or oral means, orientation, through tactile means. So, being able to touch the material through relational means in terms of having conversation with other students or allowing them to bring the content from their environment. So, for example, offering for students to bring in media that is connected to the content of the class, making sure that we're incorporating ways to increase accessibility as a way to foster representation. And so these are some important things to think about when it comes to having that more intentional representation present in our space. So we talked a little bit about these last time. I just kind of want to offer them here as well. If we want to create an inclusive classroom setting, we have to take an active role in addressing potential stereotypes and or microaggressions within our spaces, either between students because they are navigating their social rules, and sometimes that involves not knowing what to say to particular groups, and make sure that we're able to support students in those spaces. And so, as we discussed before, there are four different types of microinterventions for microaggressions. They're making the invisible visible, disarming the microaggression, educating the offender, and seeking external support. And so, under making the invisible visible, this offers a corrective experience for the victim of the microaggression, as well as makes plain the subtext underneath the words, whether or not the person was meaning to do or to say those things. There are four different interventions that you can utilize underneath this particular intervention concept. You can undermine the meta communication. You can make the meta communication more explicit. You can challenge the stereotype, but you can also ask for clarification. And so, undermine the meta communication and making the meta communication more explicit are all ways for us to bring what is not being said into one's awareness, because sometimes we say things and don't realize why we're saying the things that we are. So, for example, if someone comes up to me and ask how many kids I have versus do I have kids, there's a subtext underneath that because there's this expectation that as a Black male, I should just have children, and most likely I should have several children. And so we can make that invisible visible by asking the person, what is it that you meant by that, to be able to have a conversation around what that means. And those are all ways for us to undermine the meta communication, make that more explicit, and then also ask for clarification and challenge the stereotype. So when it comes to disarming the microaggression, this is kind of more of a direct strategy that helps us to address potential perpetrators of microaggressions by stopping or deflecting those words or behaviors by disagreeing, challenging, or confrontation. So there are a couple of things that we can do here. We can express our disagreement. We can state our values and set our limits. We can describe what we're experiencing in that moment. And we can also utilize our nonverbal communication. So, for example, if someone tells an off putting joke, we can say that we don't like that joke, which is our value. And then we can set our limits by telling the individual, please do not share that joke in my presence again. So, when it comes to educating the offender, this is an opportunity for us to help folks unlearn perhaps some of the social rules that they've been given through their environments, through their family of origin, etc. And four things that we could do underneath that are we can point out commonalities, we can highlight the difference between impact and intent, We can point out how the perpetrators benefit from not engaging in microaggressive behavior in terms of biological consequences, psychological consequences, and also relational consequences as well. And then we can also promote empathy. Probably the helpful one to think about here is that oftentimes when people engage in microaggressive behavior or words, they oftentimes will lean into the, well, that's not how I meant it. That person took it out of context, etc. And so it's important for us to educate both the student, ourselves, about how we can't lean into our own good intentions, because we still have to honor the impact that our words and behaviors might have had for that particular individual. The last piece here is seeking external support. So as you are working, with your students, and you're trying to create this more inclusive classroom, and you're supporting a student in the space who has experienced a microaggression by making the visible visible, by educating the offender, or by disarming the microaggression, and you find that none of those dynamics are working, you can then support the student in finding areas of support here at Spalding or within the greater community. Uh, and kind of what you're looking for in all of this is a space where the individual can feel affirmed based on their marginalized background, or foster a sense of community belonging. So they go someplace where they feel like other folks have a shared experience with them. The next piece here I want to talk about. So we've talked about when it comes to creating an inclusive classroom, making sure that we are setting a good foundation. And what that looks like is having some meaningful guidelines that we encourage all of our students to adhere to as a way to create an inclusive and a brave space, such as sharing, not comparing, thinking about the difference between impact versus intent, making sure that we're leaning into this idea of seeking first to understand and then being understood, finding ways to encourage students to stay leaned into our conversations. We talked about this ideal of intentional representation, recognizing that our students will be their best selves in our classrooms when they see their best selves represented in our curriculum and in our instruction style, and then in the decorations around us. And lastly, we talked about here about this idea of microinterventions for microaggressions. So as a way to reinforce those boundaries, those ground rules, making sure that we have meaningful interventions in place when a student experiences microaggression by making the invisible visible, disarming the microaggression, educating the offender, and also seeking external support. And so now we've created the foundation. We are making sure that our students are represented and feel affirmed. We have the tools that are needed to address interpersonal conflict. And so now we're ready to have these conversations that our students are looking for as part of our classroom environment to help them to connect the content of the material to the context of their experience. And so as we're having those dialogues, it's important for us to think about the difference between a debate, a discussion, and a dialogue. Because oftentimes we will encounter all three or one of these kind of in our classroom settings. So imagine, if you will, two people are standing, sitting on two sides of a bridge. In a debate, a debate would be having those folks standing or sitting on the side of the bridge, arguing about why you should come over to their side. No one intends on moving. Their goal is to move, is to convince you to move from your side to their side of the bridge because it's better, grass is greener over there, it's cool over there, etc. And so what a debate does is it leads to a lose-lose situation, right? Because no one wins because no one is planning on moving from their situation or from their perspective. The discussion, on the other hand, is a is like a is this idea of I'm going to come over to your side of the bridge. Well, my sole goal is to bring you over back to my side of the bridge with me. So I'm willing to come over to where you are. I'm willing to hear you out. Really, my intent is to convince you, based on coming to where you are, to come over to where I am. And so what ends up happening is that that's a win lose type of situation, because eventually someone might come over to where the other person is, but they've ultimately had to give up a part of themselves or their perspective in order to make that happen. A dialogue, on the other hand, would be two people meeting in the middle of the bridge and having a dialogue, having a conversation about, I could come to your side, you could come to my side, or we could just stay here in the middle and just hang out together. And so I have this diagram here that just talks a little bit about how um, the dialogue, discussion, debate, like how all of those kind of intersect in terms of moving from a winning space, which is you, me in a debate, to convincing, to sharing, to understanding, which is in between a dialogue and discussion, to a more we perspective, which is what a dialogue is that focuses on navigating a shared purpose and coming from a space of learning and serving. So we've talked thus far about what it looks like to start that foundation of creating an inclusive classroom, right? So we've talked about that intentional representation, about how that's important. We talked about setting those ground rules, which is important. We've talked about having tools in place to navigate challenging interpersonal dynamics based on cultural differences. And we highlighted the difference between a discussion, a debate, and a dialogue. And so now we have our foundation, we have our mechanism for conversation, but there's still a piece that's missing, right? Because now you have to figure out a way to connect with your students as part of the process to make sure that they're able to receive the content that you're wanting to offer to them. So there are three questions that you should be asking as a part of this idea of thinking about how do I connect better with my students as a mechanism for creating a more inclusive classroom setting. You should be asking, who are my students? You should be asking, why are they taking this course? And what do they need from me to improve their learning in and outside of the classroom setting? Those are the three questions that should constantly be going through your mind as you're thinking about ways to create this more inclusive setting. Who are my students? Why are they taking my course? And then what do they need from me to improve their learning in and outside of the classroom setting? Some helpful tips are here on the first day of class, finding ways to share some information about your background, why you enjoy teaching, and then also some of your interests. So if you're in my classroom, I always have a beginning slide that talks a little bit about who I am and why I do the things that I do. Because I think it's important for our students to see us as human beings. I remember just as a student, oftentimes just thinking that, my professors were just like these people that just had so much knowledge and just really didn't make any mistakes and just like fell out of the sky with their PhDs and all those type of things. And having gotten all that stuff myself, I realized that there's not all that much special about me, at least in terms of getting to these spaces, but there is something that drives me to do the things that I do on a daily basis. And so I think it's important for our students to know what it is that we're fighting for when it comes to our own identities and our own cultural backgrounds, because that kind of gives them a lens as to why we might say certain things or respond in a certain way to certain conversations or things along those lines. So, like for example, one of the things I share with my students is that I have my son. My son is 2 years old. He identifies as a Black male, and I teach our diversity classes. And so it's really important for me to teach the diversity classes because I am hoping that through my instruction and through the conversations that I'm having with students, that when they run into other Black males, that they will give them the benefit of the doubt, that they will find ways to advocate for them, because one day one of those kids, one of those adults then might actually be my son, and I need them to be in a space where they treat him with the love and respect and honor him based on the identity that he holds. And I know that I hold a responsibility for that. And so, like, I'll make sure to share that as part of my experience. Another thing that's really helpful here is make sure that we're collecting information on our students. Some helpful things to always asking about are, why are you taking this course? What are you hoping to get out of our time? And then what's helpful for me to know about your learning style? I found that if I do not ask these questions, it can cause difficulty for me, because I'm not engaging the student in a way that makes sense for them. And so then they might become apathetic and lost in the material. And it will be helpful to have that reference point to say, okay, half my students need are visual learners, half my students are really into to the dialogue piece. And so I need to make sure that every class I have some sort of visual depiction of the content via a video or role play or some along those lines. And I also need to make sure that I'm giving the students an opportunity to have conversations amongst themselves. I also need to make sure that when it comes to the evaluative component, that not only am I offering the writing piece, which might be helpful for our visual folks, but also need to give the option of an oral presentation for those students that are able to demonstrate their mastery of the material through that mechanism. Another thing that's helpful here is to make sure that we're stepping away from the PowerPoint, not necessarily not using the PowerPoint, but more so, engaging with the students, instead of kind of being behind our podium or our table, desk, etc. Finding a way to really engage with the students by meeting them where they are. Um, it's also helpful to arrive a little early and stay a little later if you can. Arriving early gives you a chance to welcome the students, and to set the environment before you start the class. It gives you an opportunity to see the students as they're walking in, to say, "Wow, students looking a little dejected right now. I need to check in about that." Someone, and also just to say hello to the students. It's also important just to hang around for a bit. Many students are not able to ask questions directly and with other students there, sometimes because privacy matters, but also just because they're anxious and think that no one else might have the same difficulties that they are. And so we want to give students the opportunity to have space to have the dialogue if they need to by staying a little later. It's also really important to learn our students' names. There's something about someone referring to you by your name that's meaningful, because our names mean something to us. They've been a part of who we are since we've been alive. They're also connected to our cultures and our backgrounds. And so just by acknowledging someone's name, you're acknowledging their culture, you're acknowledging their history, their background, etc. And so it's important for us to honor that. The last piece here is to ask questions related to the student's experience with the course content. And so making sure that we are finding ways to think through, student X, I remember you work in X, Y, and Z setting. Would you mind sharing with us how you are related to the material by your work experience? And so finding ways to incorporate the students' lived experience in our conversations with them as a way to help them to better touch the course content. Because especially in today's time, people learn best when they're able to connect what they're learning to the lived experience and ultimately towards some end goal that they have. So I'm going to pause here and play a brief video.
Imagine that schools recruit children who have the most different thoughts and behaviors. Imagine that children who learn differently are considered children with special rights. Imagine that educators have all the tools and strategies they need to meet all the needs of the learners in their classroom. Imagine that families are viewed as equal partners in their child's education. Imagine that there is a true convergence of all abilities in classrooms that promote and change the way we think about the world. This is the vision and hope of inclusive culture. This comes from my years of professional experience, but also comes from my experience as a granddaughter, as a sister, as a wife, and as a mother. And it is those relationships that have made me most passionate about the impact of inclusive education. The roots of our educational system actually begin with the Industrial Revolution. With the best of intents, we ask our education system to promote learners who will be competitive in the next century. We ask that they have high academic achievement and competitive test scores. But sometimes it is these attitudes and expectations that are actually counterproductive to the demands of the 21st century workforce. Consider our classrooms today. We expect that students have the capacity for universally accepted behaviors. The ability to sit still, the ability to listen to the teacher, the ability to focus and attend. And we assume that all students have the capacity, neurological and physiological, for those behaviors. And when a child is not meeting academic expectation, what do? We provide more study time, less recess, more tutoring, fewer after-school activities, all in the name of academic achievement. And what happens when a child doesn't have those behaviors? When they're fidgeting, when they can't sit still, when they're nudging the child next to them. Do you know what grade level has the highest expulsion rate? Preschool. Just when children are learning to separate from their parents and be in a setting that promotes socialization. This often leads to a sense of, or lack of a sense of, belonging. And we all know what belonging is correlated with. It's correlated with intellectual achievement, and it's correlated with our sense of health. Isolation, loneliness, low social stature all contribute to our ability to participate in the classroom. Does this feeling of, or lack of feeling of belonging and connectedness affect what we see in schools today with bullying and exclusion? What then is the effect of this standardized system on educators? Educators are more pressured than ever to show that their children can make the grade, that they are judged by their children's performance on standardized tests, and they are judged by the performance of the schools and their academic ratings. Educators are more isolated and lonely than ever before. So for children with disabilities, that sense of isolation and separation has been there throughout history. Institutionalization was a long accepted strategy until 25 or so years ago. It wasn't until Brown versus Board of Education was passed by the Supreme Court in 1954 that the racial segregation ruling paved the way for de facto segregation of children with disabilities from their peers. It took another 20 years for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1974 to be passed. That was what finally gave children ages 5 to 21 the educational entitlement for children with disabilities to be educated in the same schools as their peers. Yet still, many of the children labeled with special education are in segregated settings, or what we call pulled out, where they are pulled out from the regular classroom and given specialized assistance. 42% of children with special education needs are learning disabled. By that very definition, they have average or above average intelligence, and yet they are still pulled out of the regular classroom on a regular basis in many settings. For children with disabilities, that sense of segregation, they suffer more than others. Children with disabilities are twice as likely as their same age peers to be suspended or expelled. And yet, just one suspension in 9th grade increases the likelihood that that child will drop out of school eventually and/or serve jail time. That is why suspensions and expulsions are often cited as the school-to-prison pipeline. So we have the disability rights movement. People with disabilities throughout history are the most marginalized in all of our society. Think about how we refer to people with disabilities: deviant, sick, crazy, special, retarded. It's taking a different way of viewing people with disabilities in a strength-based way, to not blame the child for her disability. And families are also often judged for taxing an overburdened education system, for bringing their school's test scores down. So now consider inclusive education. Perhaps we could imagine a school where all the sports are played by children in wheelchairs, where the mathematician moves to think, where the scholars are nonverbal, where everyone belongs and everyone participates. There are some models now for inclusive education across the globe that are paving the way, and the outcomes are startling. The academic outcomes for all the children are increased by looking at inclusive education. There's a recent movement in the past 10 years called neurodiversity. It means that we look at the human diversity that's inherent in the classrooms and we celebrate it in our education. Dr. William Henderson is a principal well-renowned in the Boston public school system who started the Henderson School as an inclusive model. He quotes 3 effective practices that make a difference in the effectiveness of inclusive education. They are culture, curriculum, and collaboration. Start with culture. All learners belong. And in fact, the environment is enhanced by having all people of all abilities within that classroom. So consider the person with an anxiety disorder who has a sensitivity to help and tutor another child. Consider the child who's a visual spatial learner who can create PowerPoints for another child. Consider that classrooms can be places where there's rich environments to be taught social emotional competence, and conflicts can be avoided by the time the children move to the playground. Curricular approaches. In addition to neurodiversity, we have what's called universal design. That's a set of principles that helps educators design curriculum for the highest of learners as well as the lowest of learners. And the result is that it's good for all the learners in between as well. Jonathan Mooney is an expert in neurodiversity and himself a self-advocate with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and dyslexia. He's developed a program called Project Eye to Eye, which is a mentoring program, and there's a component of it here at the University of Denver. He talks about using arts as a way of leveling the playing field for all children. And what else do children learn? They learn abstract reasoning. They learn logical thought. They learn creativity. He also talks about technology. Technology, despite all the advances, is still so underutilized in our education system for kids with disabilities. iPads, note takers, audiobooks are all tools that help make meaningful content to children who learn differently. And last but not least, collaborative teaming. Let's take away the isolation that the educators feel and partner them with the specialists who can help them with the children in the classroom tap all those abilities. Let's look at speech-language pathologists, occupational therapists, art therapists, counselors. All of these people enrich the experience and take away the isolation of the regular educator. Believe it or not, the cost can be the same. Those same resources and monies that go to support pull-out systems and supports can be reallocated and redistributed into the regular classroom. So there's not an increased cost to the taxpayer, the educator, the administrator. So imagine the 21st century in a school community where all of the following learn, belong, and thrive. Helen Keller, Whoopi Goldberg, Robin Williams, Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein, Nikki Giovanni, my grandfather, your daughter, my coworker, your neighbor, me, and you. Disability has inspired many great things in our culture. People who learn differently have created some of the very things we use every day. We've learned to move differently. Think about the Americans with Disabilities Act and wheelchair ramps. We've learned to create. Think about the impact of artists such as Vincent van Gogh. We've learned to invent. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone when he was trying to create a device to help his parents who were deaf. We've learned to communicate. The typewriter was invented to help the visually impaired. In fact, what we've learned to do better is to interact with one another. So inclusive communities, we suspend judgment, we advocate. We learn that living and being in community together creates better outcomes for all of us. When we are all in inclusive cultures, we create ways in which people belong. We create roles that everyone honors. We create a room for everybody to show and demonstrate their strengths. When we are inclusive communities, we teach social-emotional skills, and so that we not only have higher intelligence, we have higher emotional intelligence. We also create ways where families' cultures are honored, and all families learn together in community. We bring together, we converge people like at TED with different ideas and different thoughts to make a richer community. By creating inclusive schools where all ideas are honored and all abilities are valued and cherished, we transform the way the world could be. It could be a better place, in fact, and imagine that we change the world. Thank you.
Okay, with the time that we have left, I want to offer up any opportunity for discussion about what's been covered thus far. So we've talked about what it looks like to create an inclusive classroom through intentional representation, through setting ground rules and guidelines, through having those tools for microinterventions, for microaggressions. And then we've talked here a little bit about what it looks like contextually via the video that you saw to have a collaborative educational environment as a way to make a more inclusive culture for everybody. What thoughts do you have? What questions can I answer for you?
I do have a question. Hopefully my feedback will continue. I'm getting some feedback. I wanted to ask about, you mentioned early on, I took a note about taking the temperature of the room and checking in with students. And I wondered if you have any advice about ways to do that in an online course. Maybe either a fully online course or a course where you're meeting with students, you know, synchronously. But that has been one of the challenges I've found lately, is that I'm not getting to know my students the way I do when I'm in classroom with them. And so it sometimes makes things a little bit more challenging, especially if we're talking about topics or issues that might have some hot buttons in them or something, you know, or might bring up some diverse ideas. So I wondered if you had anything to share about that.
Sure, and a great question. I know that one that many folks are kind of thinking about right now. I think it's first important to operationalize what is considered a hot button issue, so we can all be aware that that's the space that we're moving into, and to make sure that we have everyone's permission to move into that space. And so, operationalizing what are some button issues, and then what do we need to do to make sure that everybody's on board with the conversation. Hopefully, if we have those good ground rules in place, most folks will feel comfortable having the dialogue because they know that they will feel supported, regardless of where they might fall on a particular issue. Another thing to think about is to operationalize, maybe through a scaling question. Um, when it comes to the temperature, when should we intervene or stop having the particular conversation? And so, 1 to 5 is typically mild distress. And so, with that, that might be okay. We are. It seems like we're talking about this a little too much, and folks might be getting just a little distressed about it. Maybe we can break up into smaller groups to continue the conversation, or maybe we can have a break for a second to give folks a chance to reflect and come back. But then if it's like a 6 or a 7 or an 8, maybe that is a longer break, or maybe that is transitioning to a video that talks about the topic as a way for students to lean out. If we're at a 9 or a 10, like that's making sure that we end the conversation there, with the hope that maybe we'll revisit it at a later time. The way that you can get folks' feedback around that is by having folks put their number in the chat. So, now that we've operationalized what a 1 through 5 looks like and how we'll intervene, what a 6 through 8 looks like and how we'll intervene, in a 9 through 10, everybody, it looks like this is becoming a hot button issue. I just want to check the temperature of the room. How are we doing? Everybody post their number in the chat, and we'll take a look at it. If we see a lot of nines, is a conversation that we might want to. It's probably time to stop. If we see some 5s and 6s, it might be time for a break. If we see some 4s and some 5s there, we might want to break folks up into smaller groups to continue the dialogue, because maybe the group setting is no longer safe for folks. So those are some things I might think about doing.
Thank you. Those are great ideas.
Just a couple. There's 2 software programs. I can't think of one right now, but one is called Socrative. That's an online tool that you can use. And there's another one, Donna, that I will send you when I think of it. And then you can send it out to everybody. That's one that you can get like a thumbs up or a thumbs down, like real quick. But those suggestions that he's made also, but there's a couple tools out there, and somebody else might think of some others that you can use in conjunction with those things that he said.
Yeah, thank you for those. You said it was Socrates. Is it Socrates or?
Socrative. S-O-C-R-A. Can you hear me? S-O-C-R-A-T-I-V-E. But there's another one that is really good that I'll send to Donna, and then she can send that out to everybody as soon as I can think of it. It's not going through my head right now.
Thank you for those suggestions.
We did have a request too for a link to the TED Talk.
Sure, I'll put it in the chat now, or would you like me to send it to you?
You can put it in the chat, and then I'll be sending out a follow-up email with the evaluation and the link to this video, and so I'll include it with that too if you want to send it to me.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'll put it in both places, so I'll put it here, and then I can email it to you too if that'd be helpful.
Great.
So we got about 2 minutes left here. That's probably enough time for one other question. If folks have any other thoughts or questions they'd like to ask.
I have a question. This might seem like a little bit of a silly question. This is Lisa, by the way. So I really liked your kind of like triangle diagram that you had, sort of showing like the difference, you know, how you start with me and you and get to we at the top. And in most of my class, so I teach graduate school classes, and in most of them, like at the beginning, I will try to kind of just encourage this attitude of having respect for like the, you know, other people's perspectives, and explaining they're going to be doing group work, and that encouraging them to work with people from a different perspective can be really helpful and things like that. So when I was seeing that, I was kind of thinking like that might be kind of a cool thing to share with them. We don't necessarily have like debate issues and things like that, because I mean, I just teach like basic science stuff. But I just thought that could be kind of neat to share. But I don't know what your thoughts are, or anyone listening thoughts would be, like how that would be received to just show them that diagram and say, like, consider this, you know, when you were having discussions with your classmates and other peers. Do you think that would be effective, or is that something like you just keep in your pocket? I don't know.
Hi, I'm sorry. I think you said something in there that suggested you might be inviting opinions from more than just Dr. Kniffley. So I just wanted to take the chance to jump in on that and say that there are you know, different opinions and ideas about how to situate the me and the we in those things as well. I coached debate for 25 years precisely because I saw the hierarchy in the opposite direction, and continue to believe in that. I discussed with my colleague Donna, for example, that one of the reasons I'm attracted to debate is because it's an embodiment of the expression, come let us reason together. It requires diversity, whereas the other forms of communication mentioned don't. So if you were asking for opinions from more than one people, I just wanted to say, I strongly invite you to see that hierarchy as potentially being in the other direction as well. That these are choices we make about how to structure communication.
No, thank you for that.
But I'd like to have a copy of it too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to just, we can't take for granted folks because I feel like basic science has been polarized. And so like, I think there's an opportunity to have a conversation even in those spaces about it. So I want to offer up that that's still a space where you can utilize this type of conversation too.
So I see messages in the chat, Stephen, to say thank you for today. And I want to say thank you too for coming and sharing with us. And I know I'll speak for you and say, I know you're always happy to have these conversations with people if you know, if they have follow-up questions or thoughts that they want to get in contact with you about. And I appreciate that. And I do just want to mention again, I will be sending out a follow-up email probably shortly after this with an evaluation and with a copy of the video as soon as it's available. And I'll provide a link to the TED Talk as well in that.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, no, thank you all for your time and attention, and I always look forward to supporting you.
Thank you.
Thank you.